Our second paper is from Susanne Rogers, who I think will be known to very many of you. Susanne is, of course, Research and Policy Analyst with Social Justice Ireland. She leads in community development and social inclusion policy for SJI, as well as researching and developing policy and strategies in the area of income distribution, social inclusion, public participation and access to services. Susanne sits on the Department of Rural and Community Development, Public Participation Network, National Advisory Group and the Central Bank of Ireland Consumer Advisory Group. Susanne's paper is entitled Care, Work, Poverty and Inequality.
Let's see if we can... Yeah, that's it. Care, Work, Poverty and Inequality. And it's funny because following on from Connor's told us lots of things we don't know, and I'm going to be telling you lots of things you do know. So anybody who's been working in the care sector, looking at poverty or inequality, you already know all of this. There's not enough change. I'm not going to make any, I'm not going to surprise anybody, I don't think, with the content of any of this. That's a rough scan down what it looks like. It is part of a larger paper that will be published later on. But if anybody is familiar with my shtick, two things you'll know about me. I love a control F. So even though we are talking about things like poverty and inequality and care, and this is a long, ongoing conversation, in Future 40, which I know you've probably all read, cover to cover, all 253 pages of it, care is mentioned 505 times. And this is a fiscal and economic outlook, 505 times. 273 of those are just care. So most of them are health care, so they're linked to something. But I think that that's quite telling that this is a bigger and bigger part of the conversation. And the other thing you'll know about me, if you're familiar with my shtick, is I usually have something out of a book. I did have a Diana Athill piece on care, but there was, thankfully, at the weekend in the papers, there was a review of 3 books about women's role in global economics, if you'll bear with me. I'm just picked out a few bits and pieces for this, because this is a gendered conversation as well, unfortunately. Since January, an extra 44,000 men have found a job in the US, but more than 200,000 women have left theirs. Women working harder than ever but still taking on the lion or lioness's share of childcare. Economists' exclusive focus on the productive world at the expense of any attention to informal care has damaging policy consequences. There's more. When women are useful in the formal economy, they are allowed to work to start businesses and control their fertility, but their role as producers is often seen as threatening to their role as reproducers. There has a bit here about how much housework men do, but everybody here already knows that. But I'll go on to this is the bit I think that really caught my eye. Was, again, because we're talking about care work, the value of care work and the intersection between care work, poverty and inequality. In one of the books here, it's about the failure to value caring. In 2020, this particular author, Halton, read in a Danish newspaper that women are a net deficit to society because they contributed less than their fair share in taxes and drained the public purse. It is a claim that has found traction among some on the populist right. She points out the obvious flaw in these claims, that the unpaid care women provide has no formal taxable value, and that doing unpaid care leads to part-time employment and lower paid jobs that reduce taxable earnings. She also provides a historical explanation for why care is not valued, laying much of the blame on economists. When Adam Smith wrote that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, he omitted any discussion of the unpaid work of his mother and later his sister that went into cooking his dinner. 22 years after The Wealth of Nations, Priscilla Wakefield advocated for female employment and the value of housework, but obviously Smith and not Wakefield have shaped modern economics. It goes on and on and on and on, but I just think it's really interesting that at this particular point in time, these are ongoing conversations that just seem to be getting louder and louder. How do we understand care, I suppose, is really the key basis from which all of our conversations are going to build on this. It is concept and action. It transcends mere existence. It is central to right relationship between institutions and environment. Like for me, this concept really goes out beyond how we interact with each other. It's our food systems. It's our democratic systems, it's our information systems, it's our media systems. So, but care work, I suppose, then the work that we do in looking after each other is so important. And yet, as we can see, it has been totally undervalued, and we can see that it hasn't been really addressed within policy frameworks. And again, for all of us, everybody in this room, the giving and receiving of care is woven right the way through the life cycle, early years, later years, and for some, right the way through our lives. As we navigate, I think, again, as Connor's pointed out, like profound demographic shifts. We also have a digital shift. We have decarbonisation. All of these are impacting on economic transformations. We really need to reimagine care is central to public policy, and that it doesn't only, as we said, it's not about healthcare, it's about how we really interact with each other. And as we can see from, there's some really startling statistics in Connor's paper, we're really going to have to rethink how we look after each other. And again, for us in Social Justice Ireland, there's always been this conversation about work and the value of work, and that it's not just your paid employment that's valued. That's really, really important. We can see, I suppose, Ireland it's funny looking back at some of those graphs and seeing where the emigration peaks were when everybody I went to school with, we left, that's what you did, and the economic booms and crashes. That economic growth that we saw over the past few decades, inequality still exists within that economic growth. And things like poverty and inequality are deeply intertwined in that. Again, we can see time and time again, every time we look at any statistics to do with poverty or inequality, it's the same households that crop up time and time again. And I think what you can see very clearly from that is these are households with caring duties. And that impacts, and it's not a thing of that we should all be out working. Care is necessary. We can see that no economic activity will take place without that basic care. But how do we factor that in then into our sort of policies? How do we help people to care for the people in their lives, or how do we create a system where care is accessed if you can no longer provide it yourself? And again, I think it's just that piece about, really, these are quotes from the Care Collective's book, which is excellent, and Kathleen Lynch's book, Care and Capitalism. Again, really looking at putting care at the centre of the conversations that we're having about equality, solidarity and sustainability. Probably don't need to tell anybody in this room the difference between unpaid care and paid care. Both really, really, really important. And I think sometimes, though, with the paid care piece, and just picking up from the reading I was doing on it, the paid care can be more about buying somebody's time, so an expertise, and less maybe about care. So when we think about care, that is nurturing, it's co-creating work. And again, to quote from Kathleen Lynch, it's love labour. So real care is that. Paid care, it can't just be somebody's going to come in for 2 hours a day. We just need to be kind of careful about the language that we use. Both forms are highly interdependent. Unpaid care, as we said, nothing happens without the unpaid care that goes on in our houses. We wouldn't have clean clothes, we wouldn't have a dinner. There's plenty of WhatsApp groups we're all in where, it's like the amount of work that has to be done before a woman goes anywhere, is extraordinary. But it sustains families, it sustains communities, and then paid care will provide professional support and fill those critical gaps. And both of them are really, really important. And especially, again, in light of the fact that we're ageing, as Mick said, I won't be here for some of those figures either, but I will be an old person for some of those projections. And what kind of care is Ireland going to provide for me in that time? Who needs and provides care? Again, we can see where traditionally it would have been within the family. A lot of it is still within the family. It's presumed that I will care for the people in my life because that's what I'm supposed to do. But obviously, if I outsource it, it's extremely expensive. So that is really the part of the conversation. So when we look at the fabulous figures from the CSO, we can see that there's a lot of people providing regular unpaid care. And that figure equates to, that's almost 300,000 people. But I think it's the increase of over 50% in those last two census figures, which is quite glaring. And again, we can see where it's 60% of them are women who are providing that care within the household. Again, we can see it's that deep reliance on unpaid and informal care by families. It reflects gaps in the formal care infrastructure, meaning that care responsibilities can limit workforce participation, especially for women. You'll see again, looking at CSO labour force data, amongst those who stated they wanted to work but were not seeking work or available for work, 26% cited care responsibilities or personal family reasons as the primary reason why. So what we can see, I suppose, is that care is, I suppose, it's fundamental and marginal at the same time. I robbed that quote from somebody, I don't know where, so I'm not going to take credit for that one, but I just think it's really, really true. It's central, and at the same time it seems to be sort of pushed out to the edges. Again, that we will care for our families, it is presumed. And I think, again, it's that thing of what value we put on care. So for domestic duties, it's treated as being, you are treated as being economically inactive, as not producing commodities of direct value to the economy. Anne Oakley speaks about this. This is from the 70s. But again, it's by servicing other that they are enabled to engage in productive economic activity. And it's this unpaid work, so despite it being essential for the functioning of society, it is undervalued. It leads to invisibility in policy and planning. And as this work is not regarded as work as well as not getting paid for it, there's no rights to any secondary benefits, there's nothing else accruing. But again, as we said, no economic activity can take place without the performance of those duties. In the care sector, then, I suppose what we see is, also that it is, again, very gendered. We can see that. They do tend to be low paid with limited career progression, precarious working conditions. We can see as well the crucial role that migrant workers play in sustaining Ireland's economy, again, which I think Conor's really touched on, the demographic shift within Ireland and the vital role that inward migration is going to have on maintaining the standard of living that everybody has become accustomed to since the Celtic Tiger. But we can see again where, in things like the increase in child costs can result in a reduction of the hours that somebody might work outside the home. All of these will impact on it. And again, what we can see is that women's unpaid work tends to be, as another quote here from Himmel, with a costless resource to exploit. So we see time and time again, austerity hits, governments curb their spending. It is often women who end up paying that price, as whatever supports are withdrawn or reduced will fall on them. And again, we see it's in our pre-budget submissions, it's in our post-budget analysis every single time. The funding for the community and voluntary sector, which I do think is integral to care in Ireland, reduced dramatically, still hasn't been restored. But the problem is that the cuts are not so much savings as a shifting of costs from the public sector to the private sector, because the daily work of care still needs to be done, no matter who's supposedly providing for it and paying for it. Poverty and inequality in Ireland, again, this will come as no surprise to anybody in the room. We can see where we're not, even with that huge economic burst that we have, and even the one that we're currently in, huge budget surpluses, so much money in the system, and yet the way it's flushing through the system, it still seems to be, there's a cohort who have and a cohort who don't. Housing is going to play an even bigger part of that. We could see from those stats from the Central Bank of Ireland where a lot of our wealth is tied up in housing, and that is going to have a huge impact as people retire out into the private rented sector. So even if you have a pension, you might not have a property. All of this care work for older people is going to be heavily impacted, I think, by where wealth is held. Currently it's held with older people, but that is, again, I think, as those falling birth rates and that sort of shift in demographic, I do think that's going to play a big role in where we see poverty and inequality into the future. And again, from Collins and Kavanagh, from a paper they did last year, that the distribution is still pretty static. So even if there's more money in the system, even if the pie is bigger, it's still the same people who are only getting that tiny little, they're only still getting the crumbs or maybe just the icing on the cherry on top, but they're not getting much of the actual cake. Again, I don't think I need to explain this to anybody in the room, but it's just interesting to look at the figures again. When we look at poverty, it is that 60% median line of income. At the moment, I think for the last silk it would have been €344, but when we move it forward for 2025, when we look at what the poverty line for this year is, it'll be €366.30 for a single person. So any adult below this weekly level will be counted as being in poverty. And again, everybody in this room is more than familiar with what social welfare rates are paying at the moment. And anybody who is at home and is unable to work, either through caring duties or maybe needing to be cared for, the level of income that they are getting is under that. So it's a clear line drawn between that care and poverty and inequality. Again, we're probably all very familiar with this. Again, when we look at the percentages, I would put good money now. We might see if Conor can get us a sneak peek, but I'd be putting good. This figure has to go up next year. It has to, because of what we've seen in the budget, what we've seen in cost of living increases. I would be very surprised if poverty figures don't increase next year, and I would think that deprivation will also increase next year for the same reasons. So this is where we're really coming at then, is like where those two things interact. Again, anybody who is unavailable for work, we provide a social welfare system. I think we need to commend the fact that we still have a social welfare system. It is an agreement that we have as a state where you will contribute in whatever way. It doesn't necessarily need to be taxes. As my friend and colleague Colette Bennett always points out, kids pay tax. You know what I mean? If you buy a loaf of bread, you're paying VAT on their toast. You're paying VAT on their, not that you're feeding your children fish fingers, but you know what I mean. Everybody contributes in some shape or form. We do tend to look at that as purely economic, but we're all contributing, and we should all be able to take out of that then whatever supports we need when we need it. But really what we're seeing is anybody who's unable to engage with full-time work, and even again, we can see it in the stats, full-time paid work isn't a guarantee of not living in poverty either, but it is that link between care work, having to care, access to employment, the social welfare levels that are available to you, and at the same time we're not supporting people to do that care work. So we have conversations about a country at full employment. We have conversations about our COVID bounce back was as a complete result of women entering the labour force and inward migration in the labour force. So in order to ensure that there's either support for caring or support to be able to provide for care outside the home, this is going to be a bigger and bigger and bigger part of policy conversations going forward. We've touched on that again. Yeah. So the risk of poverty. Yeah, as anybody who isn't able to work, compared to the risk of poverty rate for those who record that they are employed. I mean, that's not going to come as any surprise to anybody. But what you'll get, I suppose, is the moral hazard organisation, which would be pushed back to you. And I remember reading, it was when the UK welfare state was being discussed, and they were discussing a disability payment. Now, this would have been for minors, things like that. And that was the pushback. Well, if we give these men money, well, people would just go and chop off arms and legs. They're going, that's not really how most of us operate in the world. So welfare is going to have to step up, I think, in this place. We had massive conversations about the cost of disability payment, but anybody who's caring for somebody as well in that household, that would need to be put in place. And again, something to be put in place for the carers. Externally sourced formal care, again, I'd imagine most people in this room have had some experience of trying to access childcare, never mind affordable childcare, trying to access some form of care maybe for an older person who is transitioning into a less independent way of living. And again, anybody who's living with a long-term disability or a long-term illness, it is really, really, really difficult. It is very, very, very expensive if you are relying on the private market. So what we can see is it's essential but at the same time, anybody who's in it isn't getting paid a lot. It's very, very difficult to recruit into care work. So there's a lot of moving parts in this, but poverty and inequality are woven right the way through. Again, like the reliance on outsourcing and private market. I didn't watch any of the TV stuff about care stuff. I was told they were quite stark images that we were being presented with. I wasn't able for it. But again, you're paying huge amounts of money, and I think it's that piece about that love labour. It's about care as opposed to just buying somebody's time. But the private market, I mean, we could do a whole day here on asset management and the retirement home piece about asset management. And again, it's that profit motive over quality that we're seeing in that space. So for us then, I suppose what we're trying to do maybe that is a little bit different. Actually, yeah, the piece in the newspaper ends with none of the books here offer a solution. I would hope to do maybe a little way towards that. But again, you know, for us, the social contract is key. It is solidarity between generations and within generations. We're all beneficiaries, we're all contributors in lots and lots and lots of different ways. So what we would like to see is obviously that care is supported, care workers are supported. I mean, at the moment now, 98,000 people are currently in receipt of carers allowance. I know there was big changes in the budget, which is brilliant. And again, that poverty piece as well, I think is really, really important, that it's the same households over and over and over again. So adequate social welfare rates, that is what's going to make all of the difference for anybody who's unable to engage in paid employment due to their caring duties. So for us, we have a couple of asks at the end of the paper. I think one which I was kind of surprised actually came out of the paper was that looking at the typologies, again, you know, Connor's looked at that, like how people move around the country, the changes we're seeing across Ireland. So when we look at the population expansion, we just see that as an overall thing. But I often think, like, what works in Ballymun, will it work in Belmullet? We need to be able to figure out how these things are different, how to make more informed policy development. So we would love to see, I suppose, that rural Ireland piece as well being brought into it. A universal basic income for carers. That's I suppose key. Really, we would like to see that as the next step. I think I am running out of time as well here. Again, you know, affordable, accessible care services in whatever shape or form that they come in. Flexible workplace policies, I think, as well, is going to be really important to keep women in the workplace. I mean, that first stat from the States that 200,000 women have left the workplace and 44,000 men have entered it, that could well be about other commitments that people have outside of the home. Subsidised high quality childcare, even though there won't be as many kids according to the demographic, but you know, those who are there will need. And again, childcare is definitely much more than just allowing a parent to go to work. It is hugely transformational for the children, especially children from low economic backgrounds as well, low income households as well, that early childhood piece is really, really important. So that is more than just about allowing a parent to work. Again, improving wages, stable contracts, investing in training, these are all essential. Care really needs to be recognised as a skill. It's a vital part of our ecosystem, and that workers are paid well for it, and for those, I suppose, to ensure that they can provide the time for care, that they're not that kind of hourly contract and that's not paid for moving between patients and all of this kind of stuff, so that, you know, there's a real system put in place for all of these. And then I can't do this without talking about, you know, core social welfare rates. They need to be benchmarked. We need to ensure that our social welfare system actually delivers, that we would increase investment in early childhood education. Multi-annual funding for the sector is really, really important. The community and voluntary sector is doing a huge lot of the heavy lifting here for the for care and carers across the system. Universal basic income, universal basic services, and again, a big piece of this for us is always, how do you pay for that? We really need to be looking at our taxation systems as well, and in order to be able to pay for these things going on, because again, this is integral. This work has to happen regardless. It really will be, what sort of a society do we want to see? How are we going to support people to provide these care in their homes, outside of their homes, in whatever shape or form they need it, and not end up living in poverty and not be, I suppose, forced out onto the margins because of that. That is me. Thank you very much. Thank you.